This is the Right Now podcast with Sarah Werner. Episode 68, Putting Yourself Out There. Welcome to Right Now, the podcast that helps aspiring writers and all writers to find the time, energy, and courage you need to pursue your passion and write every day. I'm your host, Sarah Werner, and there is a lot going on right now. For those of you who follow me on social media, or those of you who know me in real life, which is funny because, this podcast is real life too, but I digress. I've been gone a lot. I've been in and out of town. I've been speaking at conferences. I've been just all over the place. About once a month, I leave for about a week to go speak at a conference or to do a thing professionally related. I actually just returned from YouTube headquarters where I had the chance to speak about podcasting to a room full of YouTubers. And so that was really cool. We talked about the pros and cons of podcasting and how it's different from video and live streaming. And hopefully I was able to kind of help some people. Hopefully. That's always the hope. The hope is always to help people. So that was bundled into this whole trip to LA where I not only got to speak at YouTube headquarters, but I also got to meet my agent in person for the first time. Yes, I now have an agent, which feels kind of weird if I'm being honest. Like I said, there has been a lot going on. And I have not just one agent, but I have 3 agents, which is also kind of weird. I have a podcast agent, I have a TV agent, and I have a book agent, which is just mind-blowing and strange and all sorts of things. Very unexpected, I guess. So how did I get here? What an excellent question. I'm tempted to tell you that it was luck and that things fell into my lap because that's kind of what it feels like. It feels like I haven't earned any of this and that I'm just always in the right place at the right time. That's honestly what it feels like. But I'm bad at acknowledging the hard work that I do and the hard work that I put into things. And that's the other side of this coin is I'm currently working with all of these amazing people because of the hard work that I put in. So I've had a couple people ask, what does this mean for you? And how did you get an agent? Because I want to know. I'd also like to be represented professionally. So we'll go into a little bit of that today. Basically, it comes from putting yourself out there. And I mean that in a couple of different ways. And again, everything that I'm telling you today is purely based on my experience. This is not prescriptive. This is not me saying you need to follow these steps to find a certain kind of success. This is just me sharing my story about what I've been up to and what's happening next and where I might or might not be going. And I do hope that is helpful to you. I hope that you get something out of today's conversation that helps you in your journey as a writer, as a creator, if you've decided to go down the podcasting route as a podcaster. So basically, I credit where I am right now to 2 things, putting myself out there in 2 different ways. The first one is going to conferences and conventions. And we've talked before on this show about what networking means for a writer, and specifically what networking means for an introvert, because I'm an introvert. You might not think so, right? You might be like, Sarah, you love people, you love talking to people. No, I'm an introvert. I've taken the Myers-Briggs multiple times. I do recharge alone. While I enjoy public speaking, while I enjoy speaking to you over a podcast like this, I really enjoy it. Otherwise I wouldn't do it. At the end of the day, 7:30, 8:30, 9:30 p.m., I'm in bed and I've got the covers over my head and I am either reading a book or listening to a podcast or doing something very, very alone with a capital A. I recharge alone. And I like being alone. And maybe some of you listening can identify with that. So I go to conferences, and for me, these have been podcasting conferences. So I go to Podcast Movement, Podfest, PodCon, PodX. I mean, there's a ton of things coming up that I'm going to. And the other thing that I speak at is tech conferences. I'm kind of in a different place because I identify mostly as a writer. I don't identify myself as a podcaster, or at least I don't identify myself as a podcaster first. I identify as a writer with a capital W, just like I encourage you to do, because you are a writer with a capital W. And I think we have a right to identify ourselves in the way that we want to. And I want to be identified as a writer. I'm a writer who podcasts, but first and foremost, I'm a writer. But I hesitate to say this, my personal brand, there, I've said it. And I also have an episode on this show about personal branding, if you want to go check that out as well. My personal brand has really become synonymous with podcasting. And so when I'm invited to speak somewhere, it's usually for podcasting just because of the second reason or the second way that I've quote unquote put myself out there, and that is by publishing. I used to think of publishing in a very narrow sense. I used to think of publishing as traditional publishing where your work comes out as a book, like a paper book. It was a very limited definition of publishing, and since I have grown to appreciate multiple avenues and realms of publishing. And so when I say publishing, I'm talking about creating things like this podcast. I'm talking about creating things like Girl in Space, which is my fictional podcast, which kind of blew up a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it also comes down to publishing blog posts. It comes down to publishing articles in both print and non-print or digital mediums. It comes down to even tweeting and posting on Facebook and posting on Instagram. These are all instances of publishing. I can hear what you're thinking. You're like, Sarah, when I tweet, I'm not publishing. Except you are. You're taking your thoughts and you are publishing them. Now, some people may quibble about what legitimate or valid publishing is and what it means to be a published person with 2 capital P's, but you have to remember, we live in an era where it is very easy to disseminate information, and that's publication. When you tweet, when you write a blog post, when you guest blog for someone, you're published. You're a published writer. I forget about that sometimes, and maybe you do too. But for those of us who are putting ourselves out there and publishing, even in these seemingly mundane ways, we're creating a body of work. We're creating a portfolio. However professional or unprofessional it may seem, we're publishing. And people see what we publish. People read it. They consume it. They get ideas about who you are as a person. And if I'm being honest, I don't 100% know what I think about that. Being visible is weird and difficult. And I'm not sure if that's just because I'm an introvert or if because I've lived most of my life under the assumption that A, I'm invisible, and B, I don't matter. It's taken me a long time to realize that I've been living under these 2 assumptions. And it's part of the reason why I am struggling right now with where I am in my career. Because suddenly I'm visible. And suddenly I'm realizing I've always been visible. And I'm realizing that to people outside of myself, I matter. And the things that I'm saying matter. And I want you to remember that too. If we feel like we don't have a big audience, we feel like we're silent, or we feel like we're invisible, or we feel like we don't matter and we can get away with saying whatever we want. But I think there's always people listening and there's always people watching. Not to get all like creepy panopticon on you, but like the things that we say and do are a lot more public, I think, than we assume. It's because of this body of work that I've created in the Right Now podcast, in Girl in Space, on my blog, which you can find at sarahwarner.com, on Twitter, on Facebook, because of the public speaking I've done, that I've gotten to the place where I am. And I'm also struggling with this because it's making me question this lifelong dream I've had of publishing a book. And I want to be really careful with this because I know that that is still a lifelong dream for so many people. And it's probably a lifelong dream for you, is to publish a book. But I thought that I needed to publish a book in order to be seen and in order to matter. But whether or not you publish a book, you matter regardless. You're a person regardless. You are visible regardless. You have a voice regardless. So I've been talking a lot about the place where I am now and how I got to this place. And I'll, again, uncover a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. But I got to this place by networking, so by attending conferences and conventions, by shaking hands, by doing public speaking gigs, whatever that means to you, and by publishing, by creating, by putting my creative works out there, and by putting my creative works out there in ways that I did not think mattered. The reason I'm repeating this so much is because I want it to resonate with you. I want you to know that even if you haven't published a book with a capital B, even if you haven't published something that's bound between two cardboard covers and is disseminated out over a series of paper pages or even digital pages or what have you, you can still make a difference. You can still be heard and seen. You can still change things. You can still live out your mission statement. And I'm really struggling with that. And maybe this is a revelation to me and only me. Maybe this isn't something that strikes you. Maybe this is one of those common sense things that I am just now discovering in my mid-30s. If it is, then I ask you to just bear with me as I revel in this revelation. But maybe this is news for you too. Maybe it's good news. Maybe it's unsettling news. We anchor ourselves and our identities to the things that we think matter the most. I mean, I revered books growing up so much because they were such a big part of not only my entertainment, but my learning and my identity formation and my personality. Books were everything to me growing up. It was almost hero worship, what I felt for books and their authors. And now I still love books, but I think even more than that, I've discovered that I love publishing, and I love teaching, and communicating, and influencing. And I think I've learned that while that does happen between the pages of a book, that's not the only way it can happen. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I am now and where I'm hoping to go and how I'm hoping to take you all with me along this very strange ride that I am now on. I was at Podcast Movement in 2018, so just a few months ago, as of the recording of this podcast. It's currently February 2019. So just a few months ago, I was in Philly. I blanked for a second there on where I was because I've been traveling so much. I was in Philly for a few days at Podcast Movement, it's a podcasting conference. It's a fantastic experience. It's one of my favorite conferences of the year. I got to speak on a panel about merchandise, which was just kind of a new experience for me. I'd never spoken about that before. Usually I talk about marketing or the do's and don'ts of podcasting or something about content creation. And so it was just a really cool new experience for me. And I met a bunch of cool people. I always meet cool people at conferences. I think that's something that writers need to do, is constantly meet interesting new people. And even if you're an introvert, it's, I think, how we stay connected. It's a tether to the real world, because otherwise, if you're anything like me, there's a real danger of getting lost in your own thoughts and floating away into your little imagination palace and staying there forever. So cool people keep me anchored. They give me ideas for new characters and stories. Despite being an introvert, I do love meeting new people. And so I met some people and I made some connections at Podcast Movement. And pretty soon I started participating in a series of phone calls. These phone calls were with people who I never thought I would have the opportunity to talk to. Namely, one of the connections I made at Podcast Movement connected me to an agency, to a talent agency. And they said, Sarah, we've been listening to Girl in Space, and we think you've really got something special. And I was like, I record Girl in Space in my office in South Dakota, and all of my actors are friends and family, and I write this as a hobby. In fact, I started it as an experiment. So I deflected and I said a lot of sort of maybe self-deprecating or disparaging remarks about this thing I had made. But they were fairly adamant that they'd like this thing I had published on my own in a weird new format to go somewhere. And so I found myself on the phone with agents who wanted to work with me. And then after I got my first agent, a podcasting agent, a second agent from that agency wanted to work with me. And she started asking me questions like, how do you see Girl in Space? I mean, do you want it to be like a film? Are you open to TV shows? I mean, tell me what you want. And I have no idea at this point, and still to this day, I have no idea what I want. I just started creating something because I wanted to create it. I started it as an experiment. I started it because I needed to learn. I didn't start it thinking, this would make a really great TV series, haha. And so, of course, I'm telling this television agent, I don't know, what do you think? And so she started connecting me with different people. First, it was a fairly prominent production company wanted to experiment with turning Girl in Space into an animated show. And we talked about that. And ultimately, deciding not to go with that. And we kind of kept up those conversations until we found something that was a good fit. So currently, this is where I am now. I have 2 contracts on my desk. They're digital, so they're not actually on my desk. For 2 actual, legitimate production companies that people have heard of, and I had heard of, despite not being like a big TV person. And that's part of why I was in LA last week, meeting with my agents, forming relationships, shaking hands, going to production company offices. If you follow me on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, you can see pictures I posted from my trip. And I got back to South Dakota after spending just a little over a week in LA, doing all these things, going to meetings, driving in LA traffic, which is an actual nightmare. You hear things about LA traffic and then you experience it and you're like, wow, they were not kidding. Like, this is terrible. So I got back to South Dakota, and first of all, I was exhausted because meeting with all these people to me was the energy expenditure equivalent of going to like multiple job interviews. And so I was very, very stressed out and very exhausted. I had used up a lot of my energy reserves. And so I was back in South Dakota and I was wondering who I was. I was wondering what my identity was and who I was turning into and who was driving this boat, things are happening. And they're happening because of things that I did. It was not my intention that these things would happen as a result of those things, if that makes sense. But things are happening that I'm excited about. Things are happening and will continue to happen. These digital contracts that I have on my figurative desk, they're going to need signatures in the next couple months. And depending on which studio I go with, if this actually goes through, because of course, there is a chance that nothing could come of this. There's the definite chance, and my agents have been very kind and very careful in explaining this to me, that nothing could come of this. We could end up not signing anything and I would just go back to being myself, and I'm fine with that. But there's this very real chance that within the year I could be living part-time in LA and writing in a real writer's room with other television writers on a show that I created. And I'm having trouble reconciling that with how I got here, because this was never my intention. I'm grateful for it, and I'm excited about it, and I'm very deeply grateful for everyone who has helped me get here. But it's just a little bit disjointed. I always figured that I would create Girl in Space, and then maybe after that I would write a book. But it's so much more different than that now. And I'm still going to write a book. I'm going to write a book because I want to write a book. Books are important to me. But there's a lot going on. So that's a little bit of an update of where I am right now. The contracts will continue to go back and forth. There are counter offers and counter agreements and all of this back and forth with lawyers, because I have lawyers now too. I don't know. There's going to be a lot of change soon. But I wanted to record an episode today because I wanted to connect with you and tell you these things, because I need to tell someone. I need to process this, and I need to share it with people. And I need you to hear this on the off chance that it might help you see things differently or help you come to terms with where you are in your writing journey right now. Putting yourself out there in different ways is how we gain traction and visibility as writers. Speaking, publishing, shaking hands. I think about that a lot. I think about all the years I spent wishing I was a writer and not actually writing. I think about all the times that I felt resentful when I saw other people's success, because I have some of that too. It's very easy to be jealous, especially when you're working really hard, or especially when you feel like you are not being seen or heard. And I know because I've dealt with that. But you can't let that stop you from creating. You can't let that get in your way, because the only way you are going to find success as a writer is to write and to publish in whatever medium is available to you. If it's Twitter, if it's Facebook, if you have a chance to speak at your local YMCA or WCA youth club, if you have some sort of way to get on a panel somewhere, if you even join your local writers group. I've always hated the phrase putting yourself out there because it sounds really dangerous. And in a way it is. Because while being invisible is detrimental, especially if you're an introvert, it's also a safe place. Being invisible is safe because it means that if nobody sees your work, nobody can judge it. Nobody can criticize it. If nobody sees your work, you don't have to take risks and make decisions and go to LA. I think that's what I'd like you to think about this week, is what moving forward means for you. How are you going to put yourself out there? How are you going to network? How are you going to publish? What's next for you? Is it an open mic night poetry reading? Is it finally submitting that short story to a contest? Is it starting that blog or that podcast that you've been thinking about starting? I can't tell you because that's something you need to decide. And it's something that you need to do. Feel free to comment in the show notes beneath today's episode 68, with what your next steps are. You can also comment in the I Am a Writer Facebook group. If you're not a member of my Facebook group, come join us. It's a pretty cool community. It's supportive. It's encouraging. It has the spirit of this podcast. It's a group of writers who care about each other, and there are opportunities there to speak up and have your voice be heard. There's about, I think, 2,000 members, maybe a little over 2,000 members currently, but everybody has a chance to be heard in this forum. And so I'll put a link to the group in the show notes for today's episode. If you're inclined to join, please do. If Facebook's not your thing, that's fine. You can connect with me on social media in other ways. I am out at Right Now Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. I'm also out there personally on Twitter and Instagram, Sarah Ray Werner, that's SarahRheaWerner, on both Twitter and Instagram. You can also visit my website where all of these things are consolidated at sarahwerner.com. That's SarahWerner.com. That's where you'll find show notes for today's episode. That's where you'll find links to my podcasts. You'll find links to my social media. You'll find a little bit more about me. If you'd like me to speak at an upcoming event, apparently I'm doing that now. I'm doing a lot of speaking. I'm doing a lot of traveling. I would absolutely love to connect with you and to hear a little bit about your writer's journey. If you send me an email, I used to give out my email address in previous episodes of the Right Now podcast. And the reality that I'm looking at right now is I'm getting so much email that I don't have the time or the bandwidth to respond to all of it in a way that's satisfying to me. If you write me a 90-paragraph email, I want to write you a 90-paragraph email back. And as much as I want to, that's not something I can do right now. But if you do email me, please know that I do read every single email I get. I read every single one in its entirety. And even if I don't respond, even if you receive back my autoresponder that says, hey, I'm sorry, I'm not able to respond, but I do read this, please know that that's true. I do read all of your emails. And I thank you for sending them my way. I thank you for sharing your story and your journey with me. I thank you for connecting with me. One other thing you'll see out on the sarahwerner.com website, if you decide to go out there, is a link to my masterclass. Currently, I do the Right Now podcast for free. I do Girl in Space for free. I was doing a lot of things for free. And as a self-employed individual, I can't do everything for free. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to offer a masterclass, and people who want to pay for it and take it, that would be just a really nice way to support me and give me income. So I started designing this masterclass, and it's for podcasters. I do plan in the future. I don't know if that's going to be the near or far future with just everything that's going on right now, but I do plan on doing a course for writers as well. But right now, if you're interested in my Podcast Now masterclass, you can sign up on my website. I open it up just a few times a year. And so if you join my waitlist, I will email you when it opens up again, and you can decide at that time if it's the right choice for you and a way to get your voice out there if that's something you're interested in doing. It is very, very comprehensive. It is 52 video lessons. Yes, that's right. 52 lessons. And I'm adding more all the time, because I just can't stop teaching once I start. And there's workbooks, there's worksheets, there is a private Facebook group where you can work one-on-one with me, ask me questions. There's monthly live streams, there's all sorts of stuff that goes into this masterclass. And so if that sounds like something you're interested in, check it out. It's at sarahwerner.com. I would love to have you as a student and work with you one-on-one on your podcast. And for those of you who are not interested in podcasting, do keep your eyes peeled. At some point, I do plan on having a paid class for writers just like you. So it would most likely focus on the marketing aspect of things, community building, marketing, getting your voice out there. I hate this phrase, but keep your eyes peeled. It's just such a gross phrase. It's been a while since I've done an episode of the Right Now podcast, so I'm not 100% sure how I usually end these. I think that often I say, hey, since I do a lot of this work for free, if you're interested in throwing a couple bucks my way, you can do that by becoming a patron on Patreon. That's patreon.com. There's a link to that in the show notes for today's episode as well. And that just helps me pay for hosting and equipment and all of that good stuff that goes along with podcasting. So if that's something that you are inspired to do, please do so. It is not required by any means. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading this episode. If you're a Patreon patron, thank you for helping me finance this show, because it does cost money to create a podcast. So thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for writing. Thank you for being here with me as I attempt to be my most honest and vulnerable self with you. Thank you for the grace you extend me when I admit to feeling jealousy and resentment sometimes. Thank you for just being here with me on this journey. I can say wholeheartedly I would not be here without you. So thank you. And I think with that, this wraps up today's episode of the Right Now podcast, the podcast that helps aspiring writers and all writers to find the time, energy, and courage you need to pursue your passion and write every day. I'm Sarah Werner, and I am really excited about the future.